Hi everyone and welcome to In Deep Geek Live. Today I am delighted to say that we have got the live stream that I tried to do 2 or 3 weeks ago. Unfortunately I was a little unwell and I had to cancel that one, but I have got a very special guest to talk about a subject that I've been wanting to talk about for a long time, which is art and symbolism within A Song of Ice and Fire. It's just what we often talk about, art and what does it mean within this context, but I've got an actual bona fide artist here to talk to us about this, which I'm very excited about. I will let her introduce herself other than to say, Sarah O'Connor, you want to say hi?
Hello. This is an absolute dream come true. I'm part of the In Deep Geek community, and thank you so much for this lovely introduction, Robert. My name is Sarah, prefer Sarah O'Connor. I am a former big law attorney who is now a full-time artist and a big lover of dorky, detailed dives like the one Robert does for Game of Thrones and other things. So I'm really happy to be here to talk about art.
Well, the delight is all mine, I can assure you. Sarah, I actually own some of her art. It is right here in front of me. If I'd thought about it, I'd have had it behind me. You could actually see it. But she's got some of it behind, some of her art behind her. So do you want to just get, by way of an introduction, I know that not only do you have your art, but you've just launched a podcast. Do you want to just let people know about that quickly?
Yes, I am absolutely tickled. It was hard. I love teaching, and it was really hard to leave some of my teaching gigs to do the art thing. And so I partnered up with a fan of another podcast to talk about children's literature, but to go in really detailed, dorky dives into them from adult perspective, and also ideally for people of our age bracket, 10 years older or younger, to be able to experience it with their kids. So the first book we're doing a deep exploration of is Matilda, and the podcast is Bohemian Geek Studies. So literally thriving and reveling in what we're doing here today, only focusing predominantly, if not exclusively, on kids' literature. So if that kind of maybe gets you excited, like it certainly gets me excited, we just recorded episode 3 and we're looking for audience participation and get in on the ground level because we started it up and we're excited to go.
Highly recommended. And I know you're looking at Matilda, which is an excellent story. I watched the stage play actually, which if you ever get a chance to see it, I would highly recommend that too. But let's get into the subject today, which is art.
Yes.
Art within A Song of Ice and Fire. Now, let's start off. As always, I've got a whole load of questions from my patrons. We'll be working our way through them. We'll take any questions from the chat as they come up. But let's just start. With art, how does art work through literature? Because we can't, in literature, we can't see paintings or anything like that. How do you think that the concepts of art work through literature, specifically A Song of Ice and Fire?
So I love puns, and I'm going to start by saying painting with a very, very broad brushstroke. Literature, even though it's in book form or ebook form or audiobook form, that's just art. Just because it's not in particular colors, in a particular touchable form, I mean, that's art, baby, plain and simple. And so when you look at this universe, what's really, really cool about the written word pre the show, or shows, as we're waiting for new ones to come, is that the written word, what George R.R. Martin does is he paints a picture that we can all see, but we're all seeing it slightly differently. And so it's really, really exciting as an artist to see just what a trajectory this story has had and how much it influences people and how much finite details. I mean, why else are we here but to just crack them open, explore them very, very deeply. And so as an artist, watching this written masterpiece take off and result in countless fan art, result in countless podcasts like this, it's something universal and primal. So art is A Song of Ice and Fire. And I love that even the idea of it being called A Song of Ice and Fire. I mean, he's so poetic and he's so beautiful, and he takes things that he's seen written before and he remasters and tinkers, just like one could argue all good artists do.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and I think that I agree completely with this idea that art isn't just like the visual art. He paints a canvas for us that when we're seeing things through our mind's eye, we can actually, we're visualizing stuff. So what we should take, in my view, is his words as brush strokes. So we are seeing what he is painting. So that in many ways, the interpretation of what we're doing is an interpretation of art as much as it is an interpretation of anything else, which is why I called this live stream Art and Symbolism, because a lot of the time he is the brush strokes that George R. R. Martin uses are quite artistic and quite symbolic. Now, I want to start off with a question sort of linking from this that Maura Lee, one of my patrons, hi Maura, I saw that you were in the chat a little bit earlier, very generous super chat before we went live, by the way, saying just a show of love and appreciation for all the excellent content and stories on both your channels. Looking forward to the relaunching of The Well Told Tale, more about that later, and more of the Traveller's Guide this Friday. Thank you, Maura, I really appreciate it. Maura's question was, colour plays a role in the books, and certain colours have certain meaning. Please discuss. I'm especially thinking of the colour red, for example, and the red lacquer of Quaith's mask and in the House of the Red Door, etc. So before you get into red in particular, what do you think about this idea of colour in A Song of Ice and Fire? What immediately strikes you?
I mean, what immediately strikes me, and I'm sure countless others tuned in as yourself, is that innate symbolism. Without having to declare oneself, a bannerman already tells the opposing side, tells allies, tells whomever, I'm with so-and-so, or you're against so-and-so. That's one way that color is used, to declare who you're for, who you're against, so that the audience gets somewhat of an understanding of how the relationships should be. What makes George R. R. Martin a fantastic author is that we now know this guy lies to us sometimes. And so to watch how he, and in turn characters, change the meaning of color or use things in a way that shows their power and influence is also tied to color. And so things like the Red Woman, Fire and Blood, he only paints with the color red. It's all of these poetic ways of saying, frankly, death and massacre is coming, and we know it from these powerful, iconic colors like red, which symbols iron, death, etc. It's all part of this water dancing. Well, what is water dancing? Truly dancing in the blood of one's slain enemies. It's this very poetic way of quickly stating what someone is allegedly standing for. And so when we see things like I can't remember, but in the recent Fire and Blood book, there was a lot of focus on, well, which color goes with which dragon and such. It becomes this who's who of what's what based on colors that aren't present in certain characters. And then it's also very noticeable when there's a noted noted absence of color, like the white and gray of the Starks. Not frankly an artsy folk, not someone who's going to invest a lot in the arts, because frankly they're busy surviving and not necessarily thriving or indulging in fanciful things like the Lannisters might know of. So that's kind of a long-winded way of saying colors signal to us and within and among characters what people are supposed to stand for, both from simply the color standpoint, but also from the art that they create and the art that they enjoy in their keeps or their holdfasts.
I think this is fascinating. There's so much in there. Thank you. I love that. I think one of the things that we as a community, when we're talking about symbolism, do quite well is we kind of connect together the things that are the same color, and we say, well, these must have echoes, they must be associated in some way. I think one thing that we probably do less well is try and think about what those colors mean. So red, we picked up, it was in the original question, and you were talking about it as well. Red is clearly one of the very strong colors that we have in Song of Ice and Fire. Blue is another very strong color that we have coming through. Red, because, as you say, it's got the red woman, and it's the color of fire and all the rest of it. And blue is this color of cold and ice, and we are in the Song of Ice and Fire. What, other than the obvious, what might red or blue kind of symbolize when we're thinking of red characters like Melisandre as a clear example, or blue characters? What might they actually, might those colors actually mean?
Yeah, I think it would be a shame to say red only means death, right? Because it doesn't. It means passion. It means tenacity. When you hear it, you think, oh, well, these gray and white Starks have wolf's blood in them. They're being engaged in a new ferocious kind of way. And so I think red and some of the more troubling aspects of red, when we think of the myth of Azor Ahai, for example, at first glance, at first book, we think, oh, what a romantic love story between a man and a woman and making this sacrifice and who's doing the sacrificing. When we take a step back, thanks or in spite of George R. Martin's long publication date, we take a second and we say, oh, is that really what the story is trying to say here, or can we see something more? And so I think it's wrong to say that red or blue only represents fire and ice, this binary scheme and diametrically opposed. Because when I think of blue, I think of the once red lake now turned blue, and this relationship of the firing up and the cooling down of different rulers and regimes and people. And so for blue, for me, since we've spent more time on red, it's this idea of almost washing over and cleansing over in some ways, even when the Rhoynar, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Robert, on forgetting my Essos history, but the idea of this river frothing up and taking over a city, and then there being this great washing over, the bridge collapsing, all of this stuff. But water is also this source of life and vitality. So the idea that blue can only be associated with the others or death or this wintry frost abode, that's just not right. I mean, go to the Sapphire Isles of Tarth and you think, oh, well, I'd love to visit there. That's a noble people who's inviting one in almost to this, at least from an outsider's standpoint, this semi-paradise in Westeros. So it's hard to say without expressly just saying you can't pigeonhole a single color, but humans love doing that. And that's part and parcel for why we love reading about words and analyzing sigils, just as our forebears did. I mean, this is what we as humans do. We look at colors, we look at words, and we think, what do we want people to stand for? And do they actually do so when we hold them up to those asserted ideals?
Yeah, I think this is a fascinating point. So George R. R. Martin doesn't just use red and blue to symbolize the thread that we often use it. I think talking about the Sapphire Isle is a perfect example. And as you say, so we shouldn't necessarily think that because Brienne comes from the Sapphire Isle, that means that she's one of the others or anything like that. That's not necessarily what's going on there. Colors have a variety of meanings, but what George R. R. Martin does try and do is give us a feel behind certain things. But there's been a lot of, in the chat, a lot of people asking about lots of other different colors. I wanted to pick up specifically, I think on one, maybe two more. Can we talk about the color green? Now, green is as well as we're having this kind of red blue kind of like opposites. Green is very much there as being the green seers, the children of the forest, the green trees as an idea. How what does green mean? Is it just nature, or is there some other kind of meaning behind it?
I think from a real eagle eye standpoint, it does largely resemble nature in this story, and in others, it's this vital, just it literally is nature. You look out the door. For many people, when you think something lush and overgrown, you picture green vines. Now, is that always the case? No, there's a lot of life hidden, buried and submerged in Dorne underneath tan sand that you just can't access. But I think largely Green and Garth Greenhand and the kind of almost gregarious, charismatic vitality that he had has been passed through the houses and is a big deal for those houses. I'm trying to remember, Robert, can you help me out here? Which dragon, if any, had green fire? Do you remember? That would be in
Well,
the
we've
most
got
recent.
yes. I mean, there's you put me on the spot, and there will always be people in the chat who always know these better. I think it's Viserion is green,
Okay.
but wildfire is the key bit of fire that is. In fact, actually, I think somebody in the chat, Sailor, Eloise says, "How about wildfire?" Yeah, absolutely. I think that is the key bit of fire green symbolism that we've got going on here.
Right. So on the one hand, we've got Garth Greenhand, this vibrant, gregarious, semi-godlike, if not actually deity-like person who's literally sowing his seeds everywhere he possibly can. And on the opposite standpoint, we have something like wildfire that absolutely destroys anything in its presence without care for who has allegiance to whom. And so I think that that's George playing a little bit of the idea of not saying each color has to mean only red is evil and Sith and blue is blankety blank and Jedi. That doesn't exist in this world. But green is definitely a very vital color. Could we, before we skip ahead, and I know that this ties into an earlier question on the point of the red and the blue, can we take a hot pause and note that House Dorne is lilac, and what is red and blue but purple? And so sometimes I wonder, especially on the houses that we don't know much about. House Reid, I think green, question mark.
Yeah, so we can let's get on to this, because this was a question we had from Christian Isidoro over on Patreon, saying, I think symbolism is one of the most discussed and thoroughly analysed, but George R. R. Martin is clearly very careful about it. Can we touch on the symbolism behind the sigils for everyone's two favourite houses? And I don't know whether everyone's two favourite houses, but there's certainly ones that we talk about a lot, House Reid and House Dane, and any wider implications that symbolism might have for the story going forward. So you're talking about the colours of these two houses, and yes, so House Reid is a green background. House Dane has got these kind of purple. They got the purple eyes as well. So what do you make of those kind of bits of symbolism going on there? And then we can actually talk about the actual sigils itself in just a second.
Yeah. So first with House Reid, I'm just gonna like put on my little tinfoil. You just can't see it. I wonder, and I'm not sure if you've ever talked about this or if we have other YouTubers talk about this, but I sometimes think in my mind that House Reid and the Children of the Forest are George R. R. Martin's approximation of hobbits, and not necessarily the good, eat everything you possibly can, rest on your laurels, enjoy the life kind of hobbits, but kind of like how George R. R. Martin had talked about orcs. Well, what about the orcs who don't want to fight in the war? I wonder if, just as I alluded to earlier, George R. R. Martin looked at the hobbits, looked at people under the hill, which is a constant reoccurring kind of point of reference and tweaked them a little bit so that even things natural and nature-like, I mean, the Reids literally live amongst and between the Reids. That's part of how they survive, how they thrive, how they've managed to survive. I wonder, and this is total tinfoil, if that was his approximation of tweaking the hobbits and tweaking what Under the Hill and living amongst and around nature means, so that we can see, at least with the children of the forest, that the forest will fight back. Green might be about growth and vitality, but there's, just like with Marjorie and the Queen of Thorns, there are some thorns amongst the weeds. When it comes to House Dane, the reason why I wanted to flag it is I'm very excited, and I'm always interested in what you have to say, Robert, about House Dane and the Starks relationship and things of that line, because it's very, very interesting to see people respond so passionately about two homes that we know very little about. It just goes to show how important show don't tell is in art, whether it's literature or a painting. And I wonder what kind of things we have yet to unlock in a purple house that embraces both the blue of winter, Ned Stark, the Starks, etc., and the fiery heat of the Targaryens and the Martells. But zip it up. I want to hear what you have to say, Robert.
Well, just one point of order. The chat is pointing out it was Rhaegal who's green, not Viserion. I said there were always cleverer people in the chat than me, so thank you guys for that. And just also, while I will answer that in just one moment, Sarah, I promise. Just because I saw him there, and I don't want to forget, Stephen Stark, happy birthday! It's great to see you here. I know Stephen is doing a live stream on his channel when we finish here, so if one of the moderators could put a link in there for anyone watching live, and they can head on over there afterwards. I'll try and remember to do it later, but I thought if I do it now, then I know that I've done it. And then finally, Alejandro Martinez, thank you so much, saying first time catching you live, psyched, IDG rocks. Thank you, I really appreciate that. Thank you very much. So getting back to House Reid and House Dane. So I agree. This is very much, and I think you said it really well. This is a sort of a writing thing. Is the show don't tell. You don't. George R. Martin has not given us histories, detailed histories, particularly of House Reid. If you look, you'll find we only have names of 4 members of House Reid ever. There's never nothing in the history, nothing, no names at all. We hear about House Reid, but no actual people from House Reid anywhere at all. So they're just this mystery. And I think that is the point of them, is that we're not supposed to understand them. We're not, right. They're supposed to be cut off and deliberately cut off, and we're supposed to not know what they can do, which means that when their representatives appear, whether that be Mira and Jojen or Howland, we're left with this kind of uncertainty about what magical powers they have. Obviously with Jojen and Mira, we start to learn more as we get to meet them more, but we find out that Howland had different magical powers to them. He had all the magic of the Cranagomen, we're told, but we're not told what all of the magic is, just a few sort of poetic lines about making castles appear and disappear. So that is very much a kind of mysterious idea. Now their symbol or their sigil, let's do House Reid first, then move on to House Dane in 1 second. Perfect. House Reid, their sigil is a lizard lion, which is pretty much exactly a big crocodile that is found in the neck. It's in the part of the world that they live in, and it's on the green background. Now, for me, and I'd love your thoughts on that as a kind of a symbol, as a sigil, what artistically that might be trying to say. For me, again, that comes back to nature. It's a description of their place, of where they're from, and it's about their uniqueness. But what do you think that might mean? A big crocodile on a green background. What does that say to you?
I mean, to me, it says, watch out, don't golf here immediately. But joking aside, I think House Reid is sometimes looked upon by other lords and ladies amongst the realm as literally frog people. And the frog people are here to say, no, we've got rows and rows of teeth. So if you come in our house, you're going to get some. And I think that happens time and time again, whether or not, and this is maybe diving in too deeply, Robert, but whether or not there was
no such thing, Sarah.
Yeah. I think that there was possibly a second wall that allegedly might have been around there, or worst case scenario, House Reid is really at the neck, I believe, of the Starkland and everything that's surrounding there. And so we look at these wolves and krakens and lions as these huge beasts, but House Reid is saying, even amongst the weeds in the garden, don't forget about us. We are here. Literally, what do crocodiles do? Bathe deep under the water, soaking in that natural light and waiting for the time to strike. They're not necessarily immediately aggressive outside of the gate, but if you come into their land, if you come onto their green, they're going to snap at you. So that's my immediate, if I lived in the Westeros land, I would actually be hesitant about House Reid.
Yeah. And I think that's I think that's really important. Is this idea that they are looked down on by almost everyone. They call frog eaters, mudmen. Nobody values them at all. Not even the other lords in the north, other than people like Ned Stark. And so the fact that you get this lizard lion that is hugely dangerous, but most people don't really know about it, and it sort of hides, and that is what kills people who come in to their land. So I think that says a lot about who they are and what they are. You may not understand us, but there's a lot of danger going on here.
Absolutely.
Let's move on to House Dane then. Now, House Dane, I really want to pick up on a thing that you said a little while ago that I thought was fantastic, was this idea we are talking about red and blue as these kind of the opposites when we're talking about the Song of Ice and Fire, and they have got this kind of purple vibe going on, not just a sigil, but the eyes of the people in House Dane are purple, and they're not George R. R. Martin has clarified this doesn't mean that they're Valyrians. They just happen to have purple eyes. That's just what the family has. And that is a mixture of red and blue, which is kind of like this kind of coming together of ice and fire, which is not just my big theory, but my way of understanding it. Lots of people have this, is that you get the Song of Ice and Fire. You have these two forces, ice and fire, who can both destroy the world. And what you need is some kind of balance, something that can be in the middle. And Jon symbolizes that as this kind of ice dragon and all the rest of it. And House Dane also seems to have that with their coloring. But they also have other coloring and other symbols going on. So their sigil is, pardon me, it's a comet, a falling star, and a white sword. Now, this is very much about their history and who they are. Yeah. So for those who aren't aware, the sort of the origin story of House Dane is that they saw this shooting star, this comet, this meteorite crashing down to Earth, and they went to see where it was, and it was on this island, and they set up home where it landed, and from that meteorite they forged the metal that they found in that. They forged their sword, this great magical sword, Dawn, which is called milk glass in color, so it's a white color. So that is very much about their heritage. But what symbolically or artistically, what does that say to you about them adding in this kind of this white, this milk glass kind of imagery?
Yeah, so I just have to say ditto first of all to clear up that. Otherwise, we would have been here for a while. Me agreeing with you. My thing is that I can't properly assess or look at House Dane's sigil and colors without pairing that up against House Martell's sigil and colors. But before I do that, I want to note purple's really interesting, not only because of the Valyrian eye color and the fact that you have to have the artist breaking the fourth wall, whether he's telling the truth, whether he's lying. This man likes to hold his secrets close to his chest. And I think that's part of the reason why it's taking the book so long, because it's really hard for him to let go of those little treasure troves. But purple itself has a lot of historical significance in art, and there might be someone in the chat who has this better than I do, but from an art historian standpoint, purple was legitimately the color for royalty because it was so hard, if not frankly outright impossible, to access the materials that one would need as an artist to create the color purple, or to create, whether in a painting or to dye one's clothing or furs or yada, yada. So from an art historian standpoint, the fact that we have any house, especially a very secret and noble house, with the color purple, albeit interestingly muted by white, hence we get the lilac instead of a bold, vibrant violet, I think is very, very interesting, because purple, we're spoiled in this century of ours, because purple is not an easily accessible color, especially back then, to choose as one's sigil. It just is. And so when I look at, separate and apart from the color discussion, the iconography is really interesting, because this house in some ways almost seems to have, dare I say, almost a spiritual source of reverence for where they landed as who they are. Where they landed is where they created their home, allegedly, is how they created this important symbol, this sword, which is supposed to be used for war, being a sword, an instrument of death and protection and such. But it's very, very rare, and perhaps you can chime in more to this point, Robert, when the sword is passed and when the sword is used. So it's interesting for any house, but particularly this house, to have on its sigil this extremely prized and coveted instrument. You see powerful beasts on people's homes and items of weaponry, but kind of the idea of the epitome of the sword, it feels very Arthur and Lady of the Lake almost, very lore-ish.
It does, and I could go off into quite a digression about House Dane here, but we'll try and keep it on track. So the sword that was forged from that fallen star from the comet, that became known as Dawn. And the holder of that was known as the Sword of the Morning. Now, the idea there was that the sword belongs to the house and doesn't automatically get passed down from one generation to another, just to somebody who deserves the honor. Now, it's a little bit vague about what deserves the honor means, but clearly something about being a good person in some kind of way, or being a great fighter, but they definitely have to be worthy of it. So where we're at this precise moment in the story is that no one has it. Arthur Dane, who was a member of the Kingsguard, obviously famously was there at the Tower of Joy. He was the last official holder. When it went back to Starfall after that, it didn't automatically go on to anyone else. It's still there waiting for somebody else to have it. What I think this is the last thing on House Dane before we move on. What, if anything, do you think the symbolism of white might be here, though?
Yeah, I mean, I hate to say that it's as cliche as purity, but But frankly, and this gets into what I kind of left as a cliffhanger here with the House Martell. If we pair up those two sigils, we've got the white star burning and blazing. We've got a sword kind of almost laying on top of, not even cutting through the tail of that star, over top of lilac. Contrast that with the sun spear of Martell, and you've got a spear literally plunging into the heart of the star. So, and that gets into Princess Nymeria, war, etc., etc., etc. But when you compare and contrast two star sigils, one that's not pierced, one that is pierced, one that's white, one that's red, one whose sword is laying at the ready but isn't committing violence, versus a spear that is actively engaged in penetrating something, whether that's for love and lust or war and anger. I think those two sigils are a really nice pair to see what George R.R. Martin is maybe saying without expressly telling us about House Dane. I in some ways consider them different watchers without a wall per se, that at least for us common folk who don't get into the white ivory tower of Martin's writing space, we can look at them at this point in time almost as a house of purity, which is not something Martin does often or lightly, because he's very much about exploring and probing the gray.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, and just one other thing on color before we sort of move on. A few people in the chat have been pointing out that purple is also a Braavosi color. So they, when the city was founded, they discovered some sea snails that excreted a dye that could make things purple. And so to this day, all of the Braavosi ships have purple sails, for example. So purple is not just a color that is used for royalty or well, actually, I rather than leaping to conclusions, Sarah, I shall ask you: what do you think that means, if anything, about Braavos? The fact that its color as a city is purple.
This is why I love this community. So thank you. Also, I think snails is maybe a real thing on how to get purple, but don't quote me on it. I think, and people can site check me and tell us if we're correct, if we're wrong, if we're heading in the right direction. But to me, it's a nice way of saying we are a free people. We are the rulers, no one else. So to me, yes, purple's supposed to mean royalty, and these people are appropriating it and saying, we don't need a crown. Our heads are high as is.
Perfect. Love that. And for those who don't know the history of Braavos, they were slaves who rebelled against the Valyrian Empire. They set up their own city. It was a secret city for centuries. And then finally they revealed who they were as an independent city that was not in any way under the influence of Valyria. So yes, this kind of idea of having our own power and being in control of ourselves, that is a really important way of looking at, I think, the purple. So thank you for that. I really enjoyed that. Let's I had a couple of questions from Ali Al Muhanna. Hi there, Ali. Connected with House Dane, before we move on from House Dane, saying, do you think a new Sword of the Morning will be named in the story before the second long night? This connects with what we were just saying. So at the moment, there is no Sword of the Morning. Sword of the Morning being the person who has control, who has this famous sword. My take on this one is that I don't think necessarily they will be named officially, but I think Gerald Dane, who is known sometimes as Darkstar, I think he will take the sword, and I think he will claim the title, or perhaps call himself the Sword of the Evening. I think the sword itself will go with him. But I would love your thought and a sort of a more symbolic sense on this with Dawn. As I say, it's this milk glass colour You talked about it being purity. A number of people in the chat have talked about white also being a color of death. Do you think that the sword, lots of people, obviously the sword of the morning, morning ends the long night. The sword itself is dawn, dawn ends night. Do you think that symbolically that sword has to be connected to ending the long night in some way?
So here's where it gets really tricky as an artist and as an enjoyer of art, because there becomes this almost symbiotic relationship that artists can have that I know George is trying to stay away from when listening to fans and having their reactions and expectations guide the narrative. I think he had entered the universe before and took a step back. So why I say that is it's really tricky making any kind of predictions or expectations. First, because this isn't our world that we're creating. We're just adventurers in it. And second, when we kind of create, just as we were talking about with the colors, these categorical, this sword or this thing has to be used in this way, otherwise the story doesn't make sense. I'm of this standpoint of sometimes taking a backseat and saying, let's see what happens, even though I'm here to talk about what we're seeing happening. So that's where the trouble comes in. Is it a cop-out to say maybe the sword's meaning and its intent isn't actually the breaking of a new dawn, but it's actually for there to be war, we're actually in a dawn of mourning, as in Ourning. I don't know. When authors in particular, since you get to play with wordplay, get to do the Tolkien-esque, oaken door and what those words mean and how they've grown and revitalized, I can't see George R.R. Martin, and you've definitely harped on this, and this is one of the reasons why I'm team in Deep Geek. If we're really going to base this huge, beautiful series on a singular sword or a singular night or a singular morning, we've missed it. We've missed the greater lessons that are happening here. So is that a little bit of a cop-out? Maybe. Is that what I think the artist is trying to do here? Yes. I also say, as kind of an easy layup, if you create a literary toy like the purest sword ever to be seen in the land, we're gonna see it used. So I would put some sickles or galleons on that for sure.
Well, my take is very much that it will be used. I think I've mentioned this on a few live streams. I will be doing videos on the Winds of Winter and my predictions and where I think the story is taking us there. But the way I see it is that I think Darkstar will take the sword. I think he will bring it to King's Landing, and from King's Landing it will then head slightly north to be involved in the battle for the Dawn. I don't think, as you say, that we should look at this as being the answer. This is a complicated story with lots of different elements. Yes, it's going to be involved. Yes, it will play a part, but it's not the be-all and end-all, this one sword. So, yeah, let's by all means treat it as the kind of the mythical thing that it is. Undoubtedly powerful, undoubtedly symbolic, but it is not the be-all and end-all of it.
And I'll say, sorry, one more thing, Robert. When it comes, since you flagged this twice for me now, and I totally scooted around it. When it comes to the kind of milky coloring that we've mentioned, what is milk but obscure water? It's not clear. Like, we're looking at Robert's glass right now. We can see through it. And I think, although maybe I'm projecting here, that the use of milky white is this potentially subtle indication from Martin. You're not supposed to see it all yet. Just wait for the morning to break.
I love it. And this fits in with when we get a description of it in Ned's fever dream of the Tower of Joy, which, let's face it, is actually the only time we've actually really seen much of this, because it's been locked away in Starfall all this time. Then everything is slightly hazy, slightly spectral, and all the rest of it. So yes, it will necessarily be this kind of like mysterious color that we don't yet understand. Just because I love a little bit of extra information coming from the chat, Rilo saying, I worked at a natural dye studio when I was in school.
Yes.
Purple can be achieved when the blue dye bath has its alkalinity increased. We've all learned something today.
Yes.
I love that. Thank you so much. It's in George R. R. Martin's world, purple is achieved by squeezing snails. But in our world, then it's alkalinity of blue dye. So there we go. Let's just very quickly, Ali, you also asked about whether Daria Naharis and the Crow's Eye could be one and the same. I know someone, possibly AltShiftX, has done a video on this. I've not looked at it. I'll be honest, I've not looked into it in detail, but my gut instinct is that they probably aren't, for two reasons. One practical reason, which is timing, how long it actually takes to get from different places. It doesn't seem to work for the story. And secondly, I have a natural dislike of the such and such a person is secretly such and such another person if it doesn't seem to have a particular reason for it within the story. There has to be a reason for a character be pretending to be another character, and there isn't an obvious reason why Euron would suddenly decide to be or pretend to be a completely different character and then just disappear. That doesn't seem to make huge amounts of sense to me. So I will look into it though, and if I think there's something there, I will happily make a video on it, but my gut instinct is probably not. What I normally do roughly halfway through my streams though, every time, is just to pause very briefly and just let you know what's coming up on the channel. As you know, I'm now starting regular Tolkien, Lord of the Rings videos. There will be one of them coming out at the moment every other week. I'm currently working on Who is Sauron? This will come out next week. Not just, well, he's obviously the big baddie, but we often think of Tolkien characters being slightly two-dimensional. Is Sauron just this two-dimensional baddie who just wants to kill everyone, or is there another layer to him? I think there's another layer that we sometimes miss out just if we're just watching the movies and stuff. So I'm trying to unpick what is it, who actually is he, and a kind of like a character study there. I'm also working on a couple of videos to do with Jon, A Song of Ice and Fire, one of which is how he is resurrected in the books. That one should be coming out just the other side of the weekend. Then another one to do with the crypts of Winterfell. So that's what's happening there. Someone, Mora, I think it was, with the super chat earlier, asked about my second channel, Well Told Tale. That it's been on the back burner for a little bit. Life and all the rest of it, unfortunately, has meant that I've had to divert my time away from it. But I am relaunching it properly. I've decided rather than rush it out, I'm going to do it in January. Proper launch. I've already snuck out some new artwork for it, so if you check out the channel, you'll see there's got some new artwork going on there, and I'm going to be getting it done properly and launched as a podcast as well as a YouTube channel. So I'm really looking forward to that in the new year. So the other thing I would say is patrons. I say it every week, I cannot do this without your support, so thank you. I literally cannot do what I do without the support from my patrons. If you're at all interested in supporting the channel, or if you want to get access to some of the things I do exclusively for my patrons, please do check out the link down in the description. And thank you. But Sarah, do you want to just let us know what's coming up for you over the next few weeks or so?
Yeah, so maybe the helpers can drop links, or I can loop them over to you, Robert. Pretty much most of the time I am making and selling amazing artwork, though I'm biased. It is amazing. You can check it out. Probably on Instagram would be the most fun, but you can find me just Googling Sarah, no H, O'Connor Fine Art. And we'll maybe drop a link for you. So besides the creating of the art, I love, thank you, Christy of Old Stones. I love doing these kind of videos. And so it was really bittersweet for a multitude of reasons when the show stopped going, since I got to do a few little YouTube guest spots. I love doing these kind of things with especially YouTubers that I watch and enjoy. And then most excitingly, because she's my newest project, I've started doing that podcast that I shouted out, Bohemian Geek Studies, just like how it's spelled. We haven't set up the Patreon page yet. Pretty much you go wherever you get your podcasts and you'll find us. And we're really dorky and adorable. And if you love children's literature and exploring it from more than just didn't we feel good reading about this, but more of the, is Matilda really engaging in the best behavior? Where's she learning these things? What kind of hidden powers does she have? And a little bit of Harry Potter crossover, because I love me some magic, and in both the more serious Game of Thrones and just as serious, but in a different way, Matilda, Harry Potter, etc. That's what we're doing with Bohemian Geek Studies. And I'm really, really excited to have finally brought it to life, because it took a while.
Absolutely, and I would highly recommend it. I only have people on this channel if I would personally recommend what they do. If we get nothing else out from this, I would be delighted if we get a boost of people listening to the podcast or following Sarah on Twitter or something like that. That would be absolutely fantastic. So please do go and do that. Andrew K saying, hope you reconsider and start covering his Dark Materials on top of your other content. I am seriously considering. I'm loving his Dark Materials. If you've not been watching it, then I really would recommend it, particularly if you love the books. It does do justice to the books. It's season 1 at the moment. They've already ordered season 2, so I'm seriously considering from season 2 covering that as well. So I'm definitely thinking about that.
I'll do can I do a little quick plug for one of my friends?
Go for it.
They do a funny podcast on his Dark Materials. So you have to like adult content and adult jokes. But 2 of my colleagues look up Kin Folklore on Spotify, etc. And you'll get a little bit of a taste. So enjoy that, unless and until Robert dips his toe in his Dark Materials. That'll be our little prod to get him going, because I want his takes too.
Not unless until this is the way we do things. We don't say go to this place or that place. There are so many wonderful creators out there that I'd love to recommend and point people towards. So please do go. Let's get back to the questions though. We had another one from Ali Al-Muhanna. I always garble that. Sorry, Ali. Saying, what about the words, the house words of the different houses? What do you think that they have to say about the characterization or the fate in the story? Have you got any sort of headline thoughts or particular thoughts about any of the houses in particular?
Yeah, if we buckle up just a little bit, I in particularly I'm really interested in what George R.R. Martin is trying to do with the Theon Greyjoy and the Greyjoy family line, both from where we are now in the story and from a historical standpoint, because those words, we do not sow, it's we rape, we pillage, we take what other peoples have created and we make it our own. They are kind of viral in that standpoint. They move amongst the river, the lifeblood of a land, and they take all that they can. And I wonder, and I'd be interested in your thoughts, Robert, or maybe even Crowfood's daughter, frankly. She might have covered this already, so I apologize if this gets on her thunder, but the idea of, we see sprinkled throughout this text, this throne that has been completely abandoned with the black licked metal. And we see this black licked metal at a few different hold keeps, these pillars in times of war. And I keep thinking about Greyjoy line being this almost, I don't know how to quite phrase it, this philosophical outlook that Martin might be having on the concept of war more generally and globally. I know that he's very much, despite war and massacre being in his books, he's very much a for the common people kind of author. And so I had been really surprised to learn back in the day how Harrenhal was actually, it was a Greyjoy who was in charge, and what happened to Harren the Black and his land and his kingdom. And we see each of these instances with House Greyjoy trying to reave a land of all of its value, all of its valuables, for this base concept of we will acquire it, we will dismantle it, and it is ours. We don't create anything of ours. We are just a war pack. And we see now in Theon Greyjoy arguably this almost Gollum-like character, where he had, in some respects, looked up to the Starks and Robb and felt lesser than, in some regards, by his own father and from his own secondhand father, Ned Stark. And I wonder, I'd be interested in your thoughts, Robert, on what you think of, in particular, the House Greyjoy line and this concept of what George might be trying to say on war's impact on men and people and the lands that they reave. Because at the end of the day, it almost seems as if Theon Greyjoy is completely now losing himself and having it stripped away, very Gollum-esque, in this coveting of power. And whether that understanding of power is accurate, it's his perception and forefathers' perceptions of what being a ruler or in charge means.
Yeah, there's a lot there. Let me unpick a couple of bits. So Harren the Black, nerdy technicality, he was technically Harren Hoare rather than a Greyjoy, but he was an Iron Islander. Now, in terms of House Greyjoy, we do not sow. I find one. I agree. I think this was one of the most fascinating sort of house words, house lines, mottos, if you like, because it's a description of them, but it's also a kind of a threat. I've not explored this fully yet, so don't quote me on it yet. But my thinking is that George R.R. Martin might be using the house words to show us a certain degree of irony. So we talk about Theon, and we do not sow. If there's any character who is reaping what he's sowed or sown, that is Theon.
Yeah.
It is that, and I think that there is a certain degree of irony coming on there. There's a very obvious irony with, winter is coming for House Stark when we look at what Winterfell's looking like right now, when it's like snow coming up all over the place, the gates are frozen shut and everything. Winter quite literally is coming, but the Starks aren't there.
Yeah.
So I when we start working our way through these, as I say, I've not worked this up into a full theory yet, but it does make me start to wonder whether George R.R. Martin is trying to use these house words in their most ironic way. Now, so, for example, House Baratheon, ours is the Fury, worked perfectly well for Robert Baratheon.
Right.
But is Stannis furious? I mean, he's probably the least furious person there. He's just this, he's implacable. He's cold. He just does what he thinks is his duty. He's not furious about things.
Right.
So I do wonder whether there is something like that going on there, I have to say. But yeah, with House Greyjoy, it is a threat, and I think one of the things with Winter is Coming that stands out is the fact, and Queen of Thorns actually says as much. Most of the house words are threats to others.
Yeah.
But Winter is Coming. Is it a threat? Is it
pragmatic?
Exactly, and it's not entirely clear. It's only when real winter has come that we actually start to see, yeah, actually maybe this is something big and serious. Let's move on to question from Haimanti Mukuji saying, question is that with John coming back as an Ice White. Now, this is actually, I should say, this is my video which is coming out next, aiming for Monday. Maybe we'll get it out for then or not, I don't know. With John being resurrected, will he understand his crypt dreams better? Will he have some insight as a White woken from being dead, and can comprehend and possibly communicate with the dead Starks because of this newfound power? I will answer that Hymanti a specific question, because that sort of gets into the video I'm about to be doing. But Sarah, I was just wondering if you could sort of pick up this idea of John. What sort of symbolism or do we have for John and death? Obviously, we've got Ghost, his direwolf, but what kind of symbolism might we have about John being resurrected and stuff like that, do you think? Is there anything there anywhere that you've seen?
Of course, otherwise you wouldn't come out with the video that we're going to start spoiling now. So I think, and again, we're in the land of speculation and what do we expect from the artist and what happens if we get frustrated when those expectations don't come to fruition. I would be surprised, and correct me if I'm missing something that's obviously already existing in the world, Robert, and I'm just blanking on it, but I fully intend to see colors that we see in Ghost, white fur, red eyes, to be exactly what we see on the pommel, a wolf, white with garnet eyes, to possibly visualize what John looks like when he's reborn, arisen again. I'm just not sure, but I would be very surprised if we don't see physical alterations that have been signaled to us since literally book one from a visual standpoint. From a nightmare's dream standpoint, I think as a reader, I want more insight and I want to be able to trust his dreams more. But that's one side of me as a reader. On the other side of me as a reader, I understand that it would be very unusual, if not completely outside of the realm, for George R. R. Martin to say, oh, well, now that he's died, here's the dream, and here's, A to B is C to D symbolism. I just don't see that happening. What I do see happening are more dreams and more conversations like the ones we're having here, parsing apart, trying to determine truth from lies versus misdirection. How about you, Robert?
Yeah, I just have to say I love that idea that maybe John might take on the colouring of Ghost. Certainly, he will. His body will go cold and will probably go whitish. What about his eyes? Might they go bloodshot? That would certainly echo what Ghost is like. And because I always spoil my videos, I don't think he's going to be resurrected as an Ice White. I think what is going to happen is that his body has died. He will go, his spirit or his essence or whatever it is will go into Ghost. And so we're going to have him surviving on in Ghost. Then we have a question about what happens with his body. And I think that his body is going to get stored in the ice cells. There seems to be quite a lot of symbolism that might be what happens. And then somehow his body is going to be thawed out and he will get brought back from Ghost and put back into his body. So it's not just like him being an Ice White, like with the others. It's not exactly like a Fire White. Melisandre may well be involved, but it's not about calling his body back from wherever it might randomly be. It is in Ghost. And so he is going to be, as is always the case, ice and fire, and also a little bit of the green thing going on there with the sort of the green seer skin changer kind of idea going on.
Yeah.
So John is the hinge here. he is the everything in one. When he's not just going to be an ice white or a fire white or an anything like that, he is going to be all of these things. And I think that will then impact on who he is as a person. I think he's going to be more wolfish, incidentally, afterwards, whatever that means. When somebody asked me what that means, I said, oh, maybe more brooding. I don't know if you could
possible.
don't know if that is possible, but I think when I was trying to work out what does more wolfish actually mean, on reflection, I think that probably means more pack-like. So I think once he works out what his pack is, probably his Stark siblings, he will be more pack-like with them. Also more of a loner, willing to listen to his own instincts on things, and probably more deadly in a way that he hadn't been before. So I think we will see those kind of characteristics coming out a whole lot more. If that's combined with the colouring, that would be absolutely fantastic. That would show a lot. But also, just we won't go down there because otherwise I'll go into a huge digression about Even Doubt Blame Bloodraven. But the colouring of Ghost, that if John gets it, it's not just his colouring, that is Bloodraven's colouring as well. The white skin, the red eye, and everything ties in with him in some way.
And I wonder, Robert, really quickly, I still don't think we've ever actually heard Ghost speak. And so I wonder if that's been a MacGuffin that we're waiting for this John, Ghost, whatever, to have happen. I'd be very interested to see if and when Ghost speaks, and if it's Ghost or Ghost John, I'm not sure. Yeah,
exactly. Someone in the chat just said, this is completely different, but The Boys Season 2 trailer has just dropped. Don't go and have a look for it now, guys, but I know what I'm doing straight after this. Let's move on. Maura Lee had another question about the Moon Door. This is up in the Eyrie. If you remember, in the Eyrie, there was the Moon Door, which is where they threw people out, and so they just fell out into the sky. And also the House of the Black and White Doors, and asking what they have in common. What they have in common, obviously, is that they are black and white, because they are made from the weirwoods, and also just completely forgotten, but ironwood. But it's sort of basically ebony and ivory is the kind of the feel to it. Now, what I'd like to put to you is what, obviously, that's a kind of, for us, that's a kind of a yin yang kind of thing. It's about opposites. What might that symbolism mean more broadly, though?
That's hard for me to say, because I haven't really ruminated on it too long. What I will say is, when I look at the House of Black and White, separate and apart from the Moon Doors, I immediately think of, having watched the recent Tolkien movie that's maybe not as recent, this idea of the two trees growing together and intertwined. That's Tolkien there. Lord of the Rings. And I wonder, I don't have a solid answer on it. What I will say is that there's clearly a dichotomy between life and death, whether or not we want to call that black and white. I'm a little bit tired of that trope now, but I think if we ignore what that means to us as readers and as art consumers, we're pretending we don't live in the world in which we exist and in which these characters exist. For the Moon Door, really the only tidbit that I can add is, I know that George was disappointed. He liked the show's version better of it being in the floor instead of pushed out, kind of like how the prisons in House Aaron are set up, where it's just this empty door and you walk straight out instead of fall straight under. Either way, you're falling from a great height. I don't know. So I don't have a good solid answer for that, except that I think that there's a little bit of homage there to the trees that were so significant in Tolkien. And then if we look at that kind of up at the top of the pyramid, then we start digging into the dirt regarding how cool that neural network is and the symbolism of the weirwood trees, which is its own conversation. And what does a neural and active brain, a living active something, what's that doing in a house of death? It really makes the mind ponder, and I certainly don't have the solid answer on that.
No, and I think that's fair. And I don't think we need to have a solid answer. I think the only other clue we've got is the moon, because on the House of Black and White's doors there is a carved moon face, and obviously we've got the moon doors. What would you sort of say symbolically is the moon then? It's night and dark. What's that about?
Yeah, I mean, we could list off a ton of different adjectives, right? I mean, sun, masculine, yellow, booming, moon, this feminine, demure. Yeah, that's totally me and a lot of women these days, right? It's this idea. I think if we could piggyback off of maybe the sigil of House Tarth, even though, again, that's the cool thing about this world, well, where do we see a moon? Where else do we see a moon? We get to pocket and frame market. And House Tarth, we've talked about suns and these burning sigils on Dorne and Martell earlier. Tarth marries both of them, 2 suns, 2 moons. And I think Brienne is this very interesting compilation of this reimagined what it means to be a knight, what it means to be a woman. And so it's interesting here because we're talking about the House of Black and White, we're talking about moon doors and House Aaron, and somehow I'm off in the Sapphire Isles, right, talking about Tarth. But that's because all of these art symbols, all of these art colors are intentionally created by the author and collaborators to have us do this jigsaw puzzle of, is Martin intending a masculine, feminine thing here? Well, I think ultimately, and at the end of the day, and when fans and deep divers sometimes get into trouble, is thinking that one interpretation has to exist at the exclusion of the other. And that's, again, it's just going to be an In Deep Geek fangirl moment. That's why I really like this channel, because here we recognize just because we have one really true or seemingly true thing doesn't mean that another interpretation or another meaning isn't just as applicable or equally applicable. So I mean, it's interesting to I guess look at it from this masculine feminine standpoint, because the moon is supposed to symbolize this womb of rebirth and life. Meanwhile, you're walking to your death. So or you've been chosen for death by an agent of the House of Black and White. So it's very, very interesting to see the numerous ways death and life and rebirth, etc., is represented in this series.
Yeah, absolutely, and thank you for the compliment. I think that the life and death thing is made deliberately complex by George R.R. Martin here. This is something on the show, they tried to set this up as being this battle between the living and the dead, as well as being good and evil. In the books, it's nowhere near that simple. You're going to have lots of different groups of people, all of which have some sort of dead thing going on with them. If John's leading the group of the living, he's hardly going to be the living then. He will have been dead himself.
Right.
We had Beric Dondarrion. Clearly he had been dead. Lady Stoneheart wandering around. We've got the Mountain. The amount of characters who are not just truly alive, and yet we might count them as being human in some way, is really quite large. And then when you start to expand this out to wider thoughts about who else is out there, who's kind of like sort of tiptoeing along this line between living and dead, you get the House of the Undying, which is quite literally just people who are they still alive, maybe just. Then you get the weirwood trees, and if you think about when Bran is exploring the cave through the eyes of Hodor, then he sees all of these people who are sort of hooked up to the Weirwood network who look like they might be dead, but then their eyes move and he thinks, oh, maybe they're alive. There is so much grey area here between the living and the dead that George R. R. Martin just baked into this whole story. So yeah, it's not a simple alive versus dead kind of story. It's a lot more complex than that. Stephen Lucy, thank you so much for the super chat, saying, no question, just appreciating a great live stream with a lovely cup of tea in my awesome IDG mug. Somehow it makes everything taste better. Thank you. And I feel I should probably do a plug for my merch now.
Yeah.
It's Christmas, guys. If you'd like to buy some, there's a link downstairs. Down below. So yeah, there's mugs and mouse mats and stuff like that. Thank you very much, Stephen. I very much appreciate it. Let's go on to a question from Anne Clow. I hope I pronounced it right this time, Anne, saying, hello, Robert, and nice to meet you, Sarah. I noticed that most of the art we see in Game of Thrones is either religious, such as statues or paintings of gods, or heraldic. Am I missing other examples? Think of the statues of the dead Starks as being religious as well. So are there, within this world, is there much art for art's sake that you've discovered? Or is it just this religious art or heraldic art? And are there other types?
So awesome question. And it reminds me a lot of the real world, right? Because some of the most massive, impressive, just gobsmacking to behold is religious architecture or religious iconography and paintings, et cetera, et cetera. So you certainly have that. I mean, think about the Great Sept before it was boom in the show. So yes, does art exist in this world and in that world outside of religious iconography or architecture? Of course. But just like in that world and in this world, sometimes art is seen as an indulgence. I would argue it's not just an indulgence. I mean, what we're doing here is, in a way, a kind of performance art where our materials are dorky nuggets that we're shining and polishing and remantling and dismantling all together. So do we see art for art's sake in Westeros and Essos? Of course we do. I mean, Lannisport, to me, probably stands out as a really good place to at least remember, yes, jewelry merchants, for example, are very prolific there, or that's what it seems like. We think about the awful grayscale, saturated doll that Shireen got, at least in the show version, and how awful that was for that portion of the Baratheon family and the impact that it had on Shireen, her mother, her father, etc. So that's kind of an instance of where art can be used for ill purposes. But you will see, just like history, a lot of the most important tapestries. I know Robert's tapestries was something that maybe we'll get into, maybe we don't. That's just a thing that ancestral families, or any family in this day and age, will acquire, will collect art to show we have enough funds to be able to afford finer things in life. And also, life doesn't just have to be doom and gloom. We can enjoy beautiful things or things that symbolize who we are as a people. But again, if the people don't value art, you'll see art more represented in the shields that people have. That's art. Or the weaponry, the pommels, and Micah's mark. So you do see artists and their mark. And we, as readers or show watchers or movie watchers, we really pay attention to those things. I mean, how long did we spend dissecting what Arya's weapon could have been, should have been. That was probably, I know this is a little bit of a segue, but that was really cool as an artist who does commissions gets to see when people were laughing and saying like, what are these directions that she gave to Gendry? Well, we're watching in real time what art commissions do look like and how artists and smiths, etc., relate. So yes, we see it more often in certain realms, but just like in the real world, art isn't just for the high and mighty.
Yeah, and it has. I mean, I don't think I can add much to that. I think that was a really good overview of where we can see art in this world. George R. R. Martin has got a well-rounded world, and obviously art is in there. Things like tapestries, I'd just sort of add. In castles, they were all along the walls. That was how they kept the heat in. So you didn't just have bare stone walls, you would have tapestries around the place. So up north, art is not just something pretty to look at, but it's also functional as well.
Right.
And you get, all the time you get Sansa and Arya who are doing their needlework and all the rest of it. It's there's it all over the place. When you see Tyrion going through his sort of great tour of Essos, he's always coming across merchants who are selling beautifully carved bits of wood from the forest of Qohor or something like that. So it is absolutely everywhere. It's just that we don't necessarily always see it. Incidentally, that's the kind of thing that if you're making a TV show, you don't get commission artists to do spending thousands of pounds just to do something randomly in the background unless it's going to be important. More's the pity for artists, I'm sure.
Exactly.
But this is the kind of thing that they would try and make sure that things looked beautiful rather than having just art for art's sake, just randomly in the background. But this is it's not a question that actually came up from my patrons, but it's a question that comes up a lot, which I did want to talk to you about this idea of sort of art for art's sake connected with the others. Now, this is one of the most famous lines about the others. Mance Rayder uses it. There was symbolism that we saw all the way through. They obviously didn't do anything with it in the end, but there was a lot of symbolism about the arranging the bodies that the White Walkers did on the show. In the books, we get Mance Rayder. He just sort of like says, ever the artists, always the artists. Does the fact that the others in the books here, let's not talk about the show on this one, but in the books, the fact that they do create, let's call it art, symbols, that whatever, does that imply a certain degree of culture or intelligence or civilization or anything like that? What can we learn from the fact that they create art in some way?
I mean, I'll say it shows they're sentient beings, period. At the lowest, at the bare minimum, they are sentient beings. I would say, although I'm not going to use those materials, that's definitely an installation piece that they keep sprinkling amongst the land. And I think this gets into our earlier conversation about the relationship that fans and readers have when enjoying and pursuing another creative endeavor. Because if we look at it without rose-colored glasses and if we look at it without disappointment, at least within the show running world, my understanding is that the creators had alleged, this is kind of a taunt. This is a symbol from the Night King to be kind of a blankety blank explicative to all of you people, death is coming. And interestingly, how it was portrayed and how it was executed was highly controversial. But at the end of the day, isn't that message absolutely terrifying? And why are we as readers, as viewers, expecting anything different than cold, blunt indifference to an enemy's death? Because that's what the Night King's doing. But because we value the iconography that we see, and I created an article that I think had in the title, Always the Artists, before the season finale. I think it was maybe midway through season 8, when I look at all of the different spirals in the opening credits, and we see it at House Karstark and all of these different places, what does this spiral, this sundial that we keep talking about, what does this all mean? Do we want it to be that death is coming and it's the middle finger from death? That doesn't feel satisfying to us, and yet that's what the artists have told us it is. And so it's very interesting as an enjoyer and as an artist to see the ebbs and flows of how people respond to how art is given to them. And it will be very interesting to see what differences, if any, George makes, particularly because, as far as we know, there's actually no Night King. I can't remember, Robert, if we're ever told, like we are with the show, so it's merging in my mind for me, what the iconography of the body parts looks like by the others. But I mean, way back when, before we had computers and everything, the first art that we ever have in record, at least from a cave perspective, and I have the actual dates in my article, were red dots in a cave. That was our first art as humans. And so to me, looking at this group of sentient beings using dismembered bodies, they are trying to tell us a message. What it is, we can't be sure, but there aren't too many materials to be using in the North, especially to be getting really staunch, stern people's attention. But I got to tell you, dead bodies is one way to be sure to be noticed.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I would agree completely that the fact that there is art of some kind shows intelligence, definitely. And I think it shows intent. I love the idea of these as being installation pieces. That's not how I'd viewed them before, but yes, I think that's what it is. And I think that what the idea of an installation piece from a non-artist but somebody who enjoys art is that you can actually go in and explore it and experience it. It's not just something you look at from a
Right.
little way away. It's something that uses the space that it's in. And so what they're doing is claiming the ground, and they're claiming the bodies. And so, yes, this is about death. They could have used sort of branches or something like that if they wanted to, but they didn't. They were showing this as a power play. They wanted to show death. And a few people are sort of asking about what, was this just a show or anything? It is very easy to get these kind of things muddled up in your mind. So we do have a very brief description of what is there, but not in a kind of like a clear geometric pattern. We're not sort of, it's not set up in the same way it was on the show for us to think, oh, hang on a moment, I need now to look out for that particular symbol somewhere else. So it's more the fact that there is this art there that is important, rather than the specific symbol that we need to be looking out for another time. So that's the kind of the subtle difference. Maybe that will change because we've not had much about the others so far, to be honest, in the books.
Yeah.
We've had so much more. We had so much more in the show. George R. Martin has kept them really quite secret thus far. So maybe that's all to come. But yeah, I'm grateful for that as a sort of an unpacking of what it actually means that there was this art. I think it tells us that there is an intelligence there is an intent there, and art is done for yourself as an expression of your own creativity, but it's also often done for other people.
Right.
And that is the two elements that we have to kind of unpick here. Yes, they're wanting to do this for themselves, but it's also, I suspect, as a warning for the people who see it.
Absolutely.
So that's where we're at with that. Guys, we've got, I think, 2 more questions from my patrons, and then we'll try and pick up as many questions that we can in the chat. We'll try and make sure that we definitely end before the hour. So we probably got, well, let's aim for that another 10 15 minutes and see how we go. But we've got a couple of other questions from my patrons. Morley was asking about statues.
Yeah.
Now, what role do statues play in this Song of Ice and Fire? There are lots of them. Obviously, there are statues down in the crypts of Winterfell, but there's also quite a lot of other ones that our attention is drawn to. The Titan of Braavos is a huge statue, and there's obviously within the House of Black and White there are again lots of statues of deities. What's the role of a statue?
Yeah, I mean, I'll do the easy layup and maybe leave some harder details for you to clean up, Robert. That'll be the nice thing to do.
That.
So one of the easiest and most well-known uses for statues is to show power and prominence, just like other art forms, right? Kind of the classic thing that we can think about from our worlds is gargoyles being perched on top of cathedrals, churches, and the like, these almost like dragon-like things. Well, where do we see that in this world? We certainly see it on Dragonstone as the most fantastical location, one of the places George was maybe most fanatical about getting it right in the Illustrated Fire and Blood book to make it look like the real place, because at least in the show that was hard to do. You don't see those cool stone dragons that onlookers in that world, when you approach it, think about approaching a huge castle at night. I mean, we're now in the world of skyscrapers. That's not this world. Think about Egret from the show, like, oh, is that windmill where the king lives? Anything above 2 stories is very impressive, is very intimidating. And so to see statues like snarling, hulking direwolves at the entry for a crypt, like stone dragons, like the Braavosi ready for war or to protect the land. It's a way to flex before you even enter the land, to like, don't mess up here, because we are watching with you with living and non-living eyes. It's this idea where onlookers are already put on the defense, because in a misty morning or in a late evening in particular, you can't tell if these things are living and breathing. And that's exactly what the creators want you to be thinking. And then from the statue standpoint, especially when you get inside the crypt, it's supposed to be not just an intimidation factor, but a place of memorial and a place for a people to come together to revere heroes, whether they were in fact or just in fictions that are told in the land. It's a place for people to go and really see who they are as a people and who their leaders were. And that's why it was so bittersweet and so sad when, in at least the show, Sansa and Arya comment about it not looking like Ned's face because no artists who were alive when Ned was alive are left. And so again, it returns us to that kind of natural lifeblood, if you will, that holds this story together, of art informing the people and people informing the art. If there aren't people left around to say what the art should look like or represent, then the people have already changed.
Yeah, I think there's when you were talking about sort of the mists and statues and all the rest of it, it reminded me of a castle in the north of England called Warkworth Castle, which I don't know if anyone's ever been there, but they do literally have statues on the top of the walls with that intent, that if an invading army came, they would not know if those are actual defenders or just statues. So it's a very real, it was a military tactic. Somebody in the chat was saying, I forgot who it was, apologies. It was Andrew Kay. Hi there, Andrew. Saying sculpture is a form of immortality in the ancient world. And I think that's a really important point here. I think particularly when we're thinking about the crypts of Winterfell, that is what is going on there. And when we go there, it's always, the statues seem to be sort of alive. People feel them staring at them. It's almost as if it's breathing. The crypts are breathing with the air moving. So this is very much this idea of you're trying to capture a person and a person's essence and spirit there. I think
Right.
possibly quite literally in the cases of the crypts of Winterfell. But what you find is, and George R. R. Martin, I think, uses statues really well for this, is to show change as well. And if you go to places like Volantis, then one of the things Tyrion notices is that there's huge amounts of statues with their heads lopped off. Again, this is something which happened in the real world. This was statues of Mary and the like. When we had the Reformation, they would have their heads lopped off. We can't be having that kind of thing anymore. And this was old heroes who are no longer heroes. The statue would remain, but it would be a headless statue.
Right.
And I think that's showing that it's there as a memorial for a person, but what happens once that person is no longer admired, or we don't want to remember them anymore, or perhaps we just want to remember them, but in a bad way.
Yeah, I live in Virginia, and the idea of certain statues, and we won't get in there, but the idea of statues being taken up, torn down, etc. It's not just in fiction, and that's what's very cool as an artist and reader, to see some of these lessons playing out in real time in the real world.
Yeah, absolutely. And just random examples in the real world, those of us who are ancient can remember statues of despots, Saddam Hussein, whoever, being pulled down. It's a very real and very visceral thing for people to see a statue of a person pulled down. In riots, then statues of people that the rioters don't like often get defaced. That's just
right.
the way that we do things. I think the other one that I wanted to pick up on statue is the Titan of Braavos, which is it's many things. The Titan of Braavos, it's like an early warning system and all the rest of it for the city. But as much as anything else, it's an expression of the city, and it's an expression of power and authority, because it is massive.
Right.
And this is the first thing you see, and it's almost trying to overawe people, to say, look what we can do.
Right.
You might not know about us, you might not have seen the city yet, but look at this. What do you think that element of sort of art as a mechanism of political power, do you think
100%. 100%. And again, to go back to the show, maybe, I loved the moment when Arya is being shepherded over, and the horns welcoming her, and the captain says, don't be frightened, young girl. He won't come alive, although he can, and almost gets wrapped up in the mythos of who his people are, what they can do. And she just says, I'm not afraid. In essence, I know the difference between a tall, giant, unliving statue and what real fear is. And this is not where I'm going to put my fear. So I thought that in particular was a very poignant moment for the show to signify kind of two ends of the spectrum. On the one hand, we've got people who believe in something and understand what it represents, and a complete outsider who says sometimes a statue is just a statue, but that's only because of who she is, what she's grown up with, and almost an outsider-insider niche path into that world that most seafaring people would not be experiencing. Because if this is the way that theoretically most, if not all, of boats are greeted into that new land, it would be a wonder of the world today, and certainly back then, to make it clear what a powerful people they are financially and kind of from the human spirit, rich tenaciously like that, because the sword's broken. They will fight no matter what.
Yeah. And I think that if you go to Old Nan, we often hold up Old Nan as being like the person who's telling the true stories. She tells some stories that are absolute rubbish as well. But she tells a story about how the Titan of Braavos, when Braavos is in trouble, it sort of comes to life and wades out and destroys anyone attacking Braavos. That is not true, but it shows the power of having this kind of hugely symbolic thing there, that people who have never been to Braavos have heard of the Titan of Braavos.
Right.
And that is the intent there. It's not just people who see it, but people the other side of the world will have heard of the rumors, and then they start telling stories about them.
Yeah, and I'll also say that it's a in another way, it's a source of comfort for the people for whom the statues are protecting. I mean, I love the idea of having my little boyo dog, having a statue of him at the front of the house, showing people, beware, a big dog lives here. But at the end of the day, he's a big old cuddle puppy. But what I know is outsiders look at him and think, don't mess with her. This is a big old wolf dog. And so I think as much as it may be an outsider a warning, it's a comfort, perhaps a false comfort sometimes, for the people for whom the statues are protecting.
Yeah, I agree completely. We've got one more question from my patrons, so now is the time to drop any questions into the chat that you want us to be answering after that. But let's go on the last question. It was from a couple of patrons who were asking about it, actually, and Chloe and Morally, talking about the role of music in the Song of Ice and Fire. Now, I know that you're sort of a visual artist, but clearly music is another art form. Anne says, I can think of music as entertainment, as transmitting history, as a means of passing on values, and as a form of magic. And I can't help but think of Sansa and Jane and how the songs set them up for so much pain. What do you think? George R. Martin loves songs. He has songs in there. They're all over the place. So they put some of them into the TV show as well. We think of Jenny's song, with the Bear and the Maiden Fair. There's lots of songs. What do you think the role of song is in a Song of Ice and Fire?
Yeah, it is, frankly, as an easy layup, exactly what it is to us. It is a method of communication to tell a story about a certain people or peoples or place. I think the music in the show was amazing, and I listen to it often when I paint. But when we zero in on the particular stories, in some ways, they arguably contain the most truth to them, at least from the essence of what people think those who are being sung about stand for. So kind of how we were talking about, is this what the man actually stood for? Is this what the people are now understanding it to represent? It's a reflection on some of the greatest love stories of the time, of some of the greatest trials and tribulations, and it becomes the history for these people, because, and it's hard for me to remember, frankly, but most people in this world do not have access to written word. And even if they do, they cannot use it well, if at all. And so songs are usually, and someone can correct me here from a historical standpoint, but songs are the way that lore and values, etc., are most easily passed on. As someone who went to law school knows, I could sing, a radio song from top to tail really well, but it might take me longer to actually study what I'm supposed to be studying. So it's this easy way for people to digest and restate tales of the time.
Yeah, I agree completely. So typically, historically, we get stories and tales that are telling the histories and telling and passing on the values. The songs George R. R. Martin does use for that. He also uses them in a quite symbolic way. So the Bear and the Maiden Fair is it's a kind of bawdy song, and obviously has this immediate thing about you get the bear and you get Brienne and all the rest of it. But it's a story about how a woman sees beyond just outside physical appearances and actually falls in love with a person, so to speak, a character, rather than just being just caring about the beauty and things like that. Then we get another type. Somebody was talking about the Rains of Castamere, which is clearly a political song which the Lannisters use to frighten other people. But there's also another element. I think it doesn't come out as much unless you start. I think it's in the books. It seems a whole lot more. But you get the bards who are singing these songs often are people who are telling the truth in a situation or hold the truth in some way. We get the minstrel who was tried to blackmail Tyrion in King's Landing because he knew about Shay. We get the one, you'll probably remember the scene in the on the show when we get the King Joffrey demanding that this minstrel play the song, and he's speaking the truth, and everybody knows he's speaking the truth, but Joffrey doesn't want to hear it. And so again, and we get up in the Eyrie, there's a whole I've forgotten his name off the top of my head. I want to call him Mandalorian, but that's because that's clearly not his name. Marillion, that's it, and who sees and knows what's happening there with Littlefinger and with Sansa and all the rest of it, but he is killed because he knows the truth. So again, it's often the people, the bards, the minstrels who know the truth that George R. R. Martin is trying to say. So it's almost as if the artists have the truth, but actually the powers that be don't want the truth out there. And that is quite a powerful message.
And if I can be really dorky here,
please do.
What do reeds do when wet in instruments? If you had a dad who occasionally played the clarinet, you know that a clarinet can't make a sound without a little reed, house reed. Where do house reed live? In the boggy little quagmire. And once that reed has been wetted, then music can be created. And so I sometimes wonder what kind of symbolism or wordplay George R. R. Martin does with things like an aria or a stanza, and those sort of plays on words and plays on song, because I think George, and we make jokes about it and the show made jokes about it, he's very lyrical with his words, or he seems to try to be. And that's why it's so funny. You know, I think it was a maester had said the trials and tribulations of the 7 wars of the false king, or with Robert. Well, George R. R. Martin calls it a song of ice and fire. You don't call war a massacre, you call it water dancing. And it all relates to song in some way, because you can't dance without a song.
Absolutely. And I think this as you say, it brings us back to what he called his entire series, the Song of Ice and Fire. It's not a story, he's setting it up as a song. So it's and I go down this route quite a lot when comparing Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones. But in A Song of Ice and Fire, we don't see it's not a factual account of what happened. This happened here, that happened there. We're just seeing things from people's perspectives. It's very emotive. It's perhaps a little bit biased. It's telling us people's stories, and that is a lot more like a song than just a dry history book. They tried, I think, to show it a little bit towards the end of season 8, the kind of difference between having what a history book records and what might be the truth. They were trying to tease this idea out, which I think probably shows that they understood that that was a theme that George R. R. Martin was trying to play with. They didn't particularly do it very well, but this is how George R. R. Martin has chosen to tell us this story, through people's perspectives and as a piece of art, not just as a sort of a bit of dry history or fact or anything like that. And so it's a song. It's something that we sing along to that may or may not be 100% exactly right. We might not know all of the exact details, but we can sing the melody. And that's that's the thing that matters. I come to the end of questions from patrons. I think we're coming to the end of our time, actually. Is there anything else, either something you might have seen in the question, in the chat, or just something else that you wanted to say just before we sort of round up?
I really like Rosie's point that I think dovetails very nicely for what we were just saying. She writes, a song also consists of different voices coming together in accords of harmony and disharmony, shaping and forming the music. I mean, if that isn't the Seven Kingdoms and beyond whittled down to its essence, I think that really hits it. And while you maybe take a quick peek to see if there were any other questions I'm missing, kind of the difference between the song and a book, when we look at one of the most recent publications, Fire and Blood, I really loved the subtle artistic touch in having the maester, you can just make it out. He had addressed his volume to King Robert, but that was scratched out. And then King Tommen, but that was scratched out. And so just as you were saying, Robert, songs are this living, vivacious thing that kind of escapes the form in a way, whereas in a book, in a volume, it becomes this allegedly factual thing, where at least in the show's version, what was very interesting, and we see that some in Fire and Blood, the maesters don't always tell it true because they have their own perceptions and their own stories that they're trying to say. So Tyrion, I think, was maybe said in passing, if at all. And so it's very interesting for us people who do both the shows and the books to see how some of the most important figures in the book and in the show get written out of the book within the book. And we see that maybe equally as interesting with that play within the play, and how people in Essos, I think it was, viewed what was going on in Westeros, and how stories and narratives get tweaked and turned depending upon who's in power. Did you want to add to that at all, or did you see anything else that we missed, Robert?
There was just one thing, I think, just sort of rounded off. Ygritte Weirwood had a really interesting point, saying the children of the forest call themselves the singers. And I think if we're to say, and I think is a reasonable assumption, that the ending of this story is roughly the same with King Bran, with the Weirwood network taking control, and they are the embodiment of the history of people's lived experiences. They are sung. So literally what we've got going on here is this song of ice and fire. The story itself is a song told by the memories of the people of Westeros through the Weirwood network. So that, I think, is a really good, thank you for that, Ygritte. I think that's a fantastic way to sort of round this conversation off. Why don't we, just to sort of end it, why don't you remind people, Sarah, where they can find you on the internet?
Yeah, for Twitter, where I do a lot of my kind of favorite Game of Thrones, Harry Potter, Matilda, etc. Just personal, it's Sarah Smartest, and I think someone had dropped it in the chat, but it's SARA Smart, SMARTIST, kind of a little play there if you got what I was actually trying to say there. Most importantly, Googling Bohemian Geek Studies on iTunes, Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, etc. That's going to get my baby podcast that I'm really, really excited about. Matilda's kicking it off first. And if you just want to enjoy artwork generally, a new look on it, I create heavy texture pointillism. It looks 3D. You almost want to touch it. You almost want to taste it. I think Robert's taking his painting. Yeah, I do a lot of oceanic work, but it's really, really textured. So if you want to feel like you get to taste the rainbow, come over to Sarah O'Connor Fine Art on Instagram or on my website, and you can engage with me. Ta-da!
Excellent. And guys, I highly recommend you do go and do that. Do check out the podcast and the art. There's some more art there behind Sarah as we speak. Thank you so much, guys, for fantastic chats and really interesting questions today. I'm just going to get rid of you for just 1 second, Sarah, so I can just point at things. If you are watching this a little bit later, somewhere up here, always get the side wrong, somewhere up here will be a link to my Patreon page if you're at all interested in supporting the channel or getting access to some of the things that I do exclusively for my patrons, or you just want to give me a Christmas present. That's the best way, becoming a patron. Appearing somewhere up here is a link to some other live streams I've been doing. That's a playlist of live streams I've done with other creators and a few solo ones I've done too. But there we go. Sarah's back just in time to say goodbye. Guys, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this. Thank you for the super chats. Thank you for the conversation. I won't be back next week, but I will be back the week after. Take care, everyone. I shall see you soon.
Bye.